first annual CSRD Student Fellows Research Symposium. Thank you for joining us. My name is Emily Dunkley, and I am the program coordinator for the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, directed by Dr. Camille Joseph. Now I will turn things over to Barbara Kufiaden, CSRD GRA and Fellows Program Supervisor.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're super excited to have you all here. I'm very proud of all the fellows and the work that they have been doing throughout this semester. Just to give you a little bit of context about the CSRD Fellows Program, it's a research program for highly qualified students that have met a GPA requirement and have shown interest in social justice research. These students have engaged throughout this academic year, engaging in research that is cutting edge and is really supported by their own passions and their own interests in social justice. Please join us by sharing any comments into the chat and putting any questions into the Q&A, and we will get started with our first fellow, our undergraduate fellow, Kiana Richard. Once I share my screen, 1 second.
Hello, y'all. So I did my research project on mental health screenings in county correctional facilities with my CSRD mentor, Dr. Becky Pettit. So in my initial introduction, I found that since deinstitutionalization, which is the process of when individuals who are mentally ill were hospitalized in state hospitals. That was no longer a thing after lots of governmental legislation, so the CMHC that was passed during the Kennedy era. So since the founding, there has always been a struggle to find a way to rehabilitate individuals who are mentally ill, and we still kind of struggle with this today, right? So from the infamous insane asylums to now we have county jails, prisons, and correctional institutions, we are still struggling with this question of how do we rehabilitate individuals. We also found that, we also know that the criminal justice professionals, such as law enforcement agencies, have to make these decisions on diversion programs, segregated housing, so administrative segregation, treatment, and other specialized interventions in our programs within those facilities. To try and treat individuals who are mentally ill or have a severe mental illness and disorder. So individuals who suffer from mental illness are still often criminalized today because there's no place technically for them to go, since we are no longer having the state hospitals to really treat these individuals due to inhumane treatment from the early days of US history. Next slide. So some noteworthy findings is that the 3 largest psychiatric facilities in America are county jails. So Cook County Jail in Chicago, we have Rikers Island in New York, which I think is kind of on the edge of not being a real county jail anymore, but I got to do more research on that. And then we have LA County Jail. For me, this wasn't too surprising just because they have a homeless population, a very large homeless population out there, and they are constantly being criminalized for having a severe mental health disorder. I also found that there are multiple screening assessments. So we have the BJMHS, which is our general assessment to test for a mental illness. So this has a variety of 8 different questions, super general, but we still lack a large portion of people getting treated due to the questioning that is on that assessment. Within the BJMHS, there are 3 different. So there's the general BJMHS, there's the BJMHS for women, and then there's the BJMHS for the for males as well. So it kind of depends, and it's off of discretion based on whether the officer or the person conducting the assessment gives that kind of test. So there's really no straight analysis on who gets which test. We also have the K6 and the K10. So the K6 is just a series of 6 questionnaires or 6 questions. And then if needed more, we go into the 10 questions of this questionnaire, basically still asking detainees, people who are incarcerated, whether they are feeling unwell or anything related to mental health disorders. Like I said, this leaves out a large portion of incarcerated individuals. Yes. And then, so also much research is still needed to be done on mental health screenings in general. Within correctional facilities themselves, just because there's not a lot of data saying which methods are going to work best. Next slide. Lastly, I have two recommendations. The US would benefit from federally mandated legislation allowing mental health professionals to be the first responders in mental health related cases. Currently, that is not the case in America, right? We are leaving this up to police officers and law enforcement agencies who are not skilled in the specialty of psychology, mental health. Next slide. And lastly, the US should create legislation that requires all police departments to conduct mental health screenings for every person going through central booking and local county jails, as that's not required since there's no federally mandated, it's just recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kiana. Next up, we have Madeline.
Hello. So, oops, one moment, please. Okay, yes. So in urban settings and a lot of urban populations, food insecurity is a big issue that 2.2 million individuals in America are afflicted with. And so what I wanted to focus on with the mentorship of Dr. Forbath and Barbara is understand how we can reshape the local food system and specifically focus on a case of equitable access in Austin. Next. Yes, so the UN says that food security is when all people have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food that meets both the preferences and the dietary needs of an individual person. Next. And of food security, there are 4 conditions, which is availability for the supply of food, access to the supply, utilization, which is the nutritious quality, and stability of the 3 preceding conditions. Next. And what I wanted to focus on was access. And if we go next, we can see that access includes 4 main barriers. And these barriers are proximity, availability, affordability, and mobility. And a 5th one of awareness was added specifically to the 2018 Food System Report by Austin. Next. And so I wanted to address these barriers and evaluate the reaches of democratic food access in Austin by doing a policy analysis on SNAP, which was formerly known as the Food Stamp Program, and do a comprehensive case study on Austin's food system. So I looked at the public Austin resources on their data portal. I also did academic journals and looked at local news articles as well. Next. And from there, I defined current challenges to food access in Austin. So currently we see there's decreased participation in food initiatives in Austin. There's the constraint of seasonality and infrastructure, as well as low SNAP enrollment and restricted eligibility. There's also a food analysis in Austin, but it does not identify those who are at risk or in the transitory states of food insecurity. There's also minimal communication among the food actors. Next. And so what I did was look at these constraints and first focused on the SNAP policy. And of the state recommendations that I drew, one was concerned with vehicle asset limits. And so that is when car ownership is incorporated into gross income calculations to determine if someone is SNAP eligible or to see how much they would receive from the government. Then there's also drug felony disqualification, which actually puts a lifetime ban on those who have a second drug reoffense. Next. And so there's actually a federal statute that says that states have the flexibility to modify or eliminate these restrictions. So I propose the removal of both, as the vehicle asset limits actually hinder people. And by removing it, it can actually increase eligibility without the coercion of reduced spending, which will help increase food access and build financial self-sufficiency, which will overall reduce the long-term need for SNAP. And with drug felony disqualification, I think it's important to extend eligibility to all who are socially and economically vulnerable, especially upon re-entrance into the community. And offering nutritional support is interdependent and critical in those returning citizens gaining financial stability. Next. And then what I wanted to focus on as well was local efforts that the city of Austin can do. So next we can see that the first two recommendations I had are about food system analysis and interactive resource maps. And this focuses on what are the best places we can outreach, and as well as how can we do so by incorporating like inequality trends as well as poverty trends in the area and contextualize that in our analysis, as well as create some interactive resource maps that makes publicly available to people understanding where food aids are or what services are available to them. And if we do the next two recommendations, I also suggest a financial program where the city can help resource the infrastructure for food retailers and complement that with a comprehensive investment strategy by also offering these food entrepreneurs technical business development training, as well as collaborative events across the food actors along the value chain. And lastly, a grab to go meal program, which is a subsidized packaged meal program to help with food affordability. So all of these recommendations really try to contextualize the social, economic, and geographic issues and states of our local food system in order for the municipal actors and citizens to collaborate together for a shared commitment towards equitable food access. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madeline, for sharing about food access. Next up, we have a graduate fellow, Dana.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. My name is Dana Johnson, and I'm a PhD candidate in the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and I'm going to be presenting some qualitative preliminary work that's part of my dissertation. And I was supervised by Dr. Michelle Roundtree in the School of Social Work. So I'm going to be talking about the economic context of medication abortion in the United States. And I think this is especially timely as today, a lot of you probably saw Texas signed into effect a 6-week abortion ban. So there's a vast literature on how the high cost of clinical abortion care has made it really difficult for people to access care. Particularly the majority of people who go to abortion clinics are low income and are people of color. And also this combination of extremely restrictive policies such as lack of insurance coverage and other policies making in-clinic care really onerous and expensive to access have prompted what a lot of researchers think this new phenomenon of folks self-managing their abortion using pills from online telemedicine organizations. So that's a medication abortion, and people are doing them at home in the comfort of their homes. But with this phenomenon, a lot of people have highlighted that there's this vast array of state policies and laws that can criminalize this practice of having an abortion outside of a formal healthcare setting or doing your own abortion. So there's a literature here really rooted in Matthew Roberts' work on how the history of slavery has been used to control Black women, particularly Black women's reproduction. And Michelle Goodwin's work more recently in Policing the Womb, how people have used these laws that criminalize our reproductive behaviors to target certain populations, primarily those of racial ethnic minorities or folks who are low income, especially people who don't necessarily have the resources to fight this kind of criminalization or prosecution. Next slide, please. So I'll briefly just talk about a study I'm working on in partnership with researchers at the LBJ School, Project SANA. It's a self-managed abortion needs assessment project led by PI Dr. Aiken. And one of the things I'm working on is really looking at the socioeconomic factors going on in people's lives that have prompted people to self-manage medication abortion, what's going on, and then also in tandem, really look at this key piece about how are people at risk of criminalization and surveillance. And we know that in the United States, policing is extremely racialized. So by extension, how is this affecting communities of color, especially those who already are often left out of the healthcare system and lack a lot of reproductive control based on how our legal system and federal and state policy are set up? So the methods here were 80 interviews with people who actually did their own abortion at home. They ordered pills from an NGO called Aid Access that is currently probably in the news. You might have seen they're suing the FDA over just this practice. And what people do is they consult with a physician, they order the medication abortion, and they have an at-home abortion. And so in these interviews, they occurred June through August of 2019. I have a small excerpt that I want to share with you all. Next slide, please. Awesome. And this is from someone I interviewed. She said, your first instinct is to go to Planned Parenthood. If you would have chosen that route, I would have had to travel 3 or 4 hours. And they do have a whole day appointment where you have to listen to the heartbeat, look at an ultrasound, talk to a lot of different doctors and nurses, just so you could be sure of your decision. And the cost would be over $1,000. No insurance would have covered it. That's very expensive, traveling 4 hours. And then we thought about the free abortion pills advertisement we saw or whatever. So we looked it up, this telemedicine service, and it popped up. So you can see, quote, this person, they faced a lot of policy barriers, and that's led them to choose this telemedicine service. But in mind with this new phenomenon, as policy researchers, it's really critical for us to keep in mind how we can make proactive policies so that people can safely access this. Next slide, please. So my recommendations are first to repeal the Hyde Amendment and pass the EACH Act, and this would lift the bans on insurance coverage for abortion for people covered by the Medicaid program, which we know covers predominantly low income and often communities of color as well. State level abortion restrictions like the one that we are experiencing in our state legislature now, decriminalizing this practice of self-management, and really taking a reproductive justice framework to this work. If, when, how, lawyering for reproductive justice, they're actively defending people engaging in this process, and really looking at the grassroots issues in our communities and how to support people in self-management. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dana. Next up, we have Allie. She is an undergraduate fellow.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Alexandra Rahman. As Barbara said, I'm a current CSRD undergraduate fellow. My research mentor is Dr. Kathleen Brown, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And today I will be discussing secondary English and US history teachers' understanding of ethnic studies and combating curricular violence. Thank you. In my research, I'm interested in expanding the scope of this violence further to the perspective of current teachers teaching in the classroom today. To do this, my methods include an investigation through data collection, an interview/survey, and an overall qualitative method. Next. At the core of my methods are interviews and one-on-one conversations with teachers, and referencing the interviews I've already conducted with secondary English and US history teachers, I have found the following 4 themes, common themes amongst all of them. First being that there is a general consensus that the current curriculum favors a white majority and doesn't include all students. Second, teachers say that the one-sided narrative that students are learning is harmful to non-white students as well as students of color. Third, teachers not only support the incorporation of ethnic studies, but deem it necessary for our future and to combat curricular violence and to act as an answer to social justice violence that is occurring in the nation. And lastly, teachers believe students are being done a disservice when they are not taught about each other and other ways of being, stating ethnic studies is rewarding for all students in the classroom. So those are my current findings from the interviews I've already done. And then the next slide, we will see some anticipated results, which aside from the moral argument that my research provides, I want to add that these findings are especially important as they complement statistical data found by a Stanford study that proves that attendance for those encouraged to enroll in ethnic study classes increased by 21 percentage points and GPA by 1.4 grade points and credits earned by 23. So essentially there's an overall gain to enrolling in ethnic studies, which my findings correlate with. In the anticipated results, by the end of this research, I anticipate that my results will inform curricular development, as it will provide a solution to the violent curriculum students are currently experiencing. It will provide further support for an ethnic studies centered curriculum in the classroom, reconstructing public education as we know it. Given my current findings, the implications of my research overall look to give credence to the incorporation of ethnic studies into K-12 curricula. And lastly, my research could provide insight into and track if there's been a shift in how teachers value ethnic studies or even view the classroom in a post-Trump era. So this is, like I said, it's continuing to be ongoing. So I will hopefully be back with more updates. But for now, I think, and I would thank the CSRD fellowship and want to acknowledge that this would not be possible without them, without Barbara and all of my mentors who have provided guidance and answers to all of my incessant questions. I thank you.
Thanks, Allie. Next up, we have Joseph. He is a graduate fellow.
Perfect. Thank you, Barbara. Hi, to reiterate, yes, my name is Joseph Herrera, and the title of my project is called Cultural Districts, Creating Sustainable Economic Development versus Catalyzing Gentrification. Before I jump in, I want to thank my research mentor throughout this process. Dr. Dickerson, your insight and knowledge about gentrification and displacement has been invaluable to me. I also thoroughly enjoy literally any time we get to have a conversation. But let's go ahead and hop in. Next slide, please. So there's a growing literature at the intersections of redlining, gentrification, and economic activity created by the arts that contests whether arts and cultural districts create sustainable economic development or catalyze gentrification surrounding areas. The two most popular opinions are that cultural and arts districts inherently attract an influx of business to raise local property values and thus create gentrification, or that ineffective city planning leads to the displacement of artistic and cultural groups, which are typically vulnerable populations in these areas. Austin and the Six Square Cultural District are a prime example of this study. The areas surrounding the cultural district have seen significant displacement of African-American families since the year 2000. And the oppression of people of color in Austin has a background that stretches to 1928 and beyond. 1928 saw the passing of the master plan by Austin city officials, which was a blatantly racist zoning ordinance that segregated people of color into a small piece of land, where is now known as East Austin. And as an unintended consequence, segregated families took advantage of their space and used their entrepreneurial spirits to build businesses that are cultural and economic pillars today. So in 2013, this area would actually be designated the Six Square Cultural District in an attempt to revitalize and preserve the rich Black history in Austin. Next slide, please. To evaluate the effect of cultural districts and their effects that they have on average housing prices in Austin, which is a leading indicator of both gentrification and displacement, I ended up creating a synthetic control model. So essentially what this is on the graph below, you see two lines. First, the black solid line shows the world as it is today, where housing prices in Austin have appreciated and the Six Square Cultural District is established, versus a replicate world where the only difference is that the Six Square Cultural District wasn't established, and that's the dotted line. So essentially the synthetic control is created using other metropolitan areas within the continental United States that haven't had established cultural districts before 2018, which is the end of the 10-year period of interest. Next slide, please. So this graph is identical to the one on the last slide, except the synthetic control model has now been normalized to be the baseline housing price per year in Austin. So in comparison, the area between the treatment and the synthetic control shows that Six Square or cultural districts account for approximately up to $45,000 in average housing value appreciation in a year at its peak. So this evidence by itself would support the position that Six Square seems to catalyze gentrification. Next slide, please. However, combining this information with other studies like the Urban Displacement Project indicates that the city of Austin established Six Square during a time when neighborhoods in East Austin were already in advanced stages of the gentrification process. Thus, it's more plausible that poor city planning is the main contributing factor. And this potentially opens the door for future research exploring the extent to which city planning contributes to gentrification and displacement of people of color in Austin. This concludes my presentation. Thank you all so much for your time and being here today.
Thank you so much. Up next, we have Finlay, and she's an undergraduate researcher.
Awesome, thank you so much. All right, hi everyone, my name is Finley Scanlon and I have been guided by my amazing CSRD mentor this semester, Dr. Tia Madkin, so thank you to her for all her help. As a Center for Race and Democracy undergraduate research fellow, my project is to examine the theory of and then creatively engage with the implementation of restorative justice practices in school. So just a short introduction to this topic. Black students in the US are 4 times more likely to be suspended from school than their white peers. Research shows that this racial discipline gap not only accounts for 1/5 of the racial achievement gap, but that students' history of disciplinary referrals at school are a predictor of their future prison incarceration. A primary cause for this is the implementation of zero tolerance policies, regulations that mandate a severe punishment for specific behavior violations. And the design of these policies and then the discretion in their enactment results in disproportionate pushing out of Black students from schools. Restorative justice seeks to replace this harmful system and prioritize mediation and community building as foundational for school peace. Next slide, please. To examine the current academic discussion around restorative justice in schools, I started with a literature review of 2 peer-reviewed articles and 2 books primarily. And one key takeaway from my literature review is that the discretion of teachers is incredibly impactful on the level of harm from zero tolerance policies and then also the level of efficacy of restorative justice. It is because of this that I've created a hypothetical schedule for a teacher and 3 students at a school that has recently transitioned to restorative justice. I have also designed a classroom design and an app prototype that will help facilitate this process. All of these practices demonstrated are based in the recommendations made in the literature review and feature the most commonly occurring issues that can be worked through with restorative justice. The purpose of such a hypothetical might be to demonstrate to a teacher at a transitioning school how everyday scenarios could incorporate restorative justice values. And restorative justice is a concept founded by Black feminist thinkers, and the work of restorative justice is still being led by Black and Indigenous educators around the country. However, roughly 80% of American teachers currently are white women, and research has shown that white teachers perpetuate the racial discipline gap more than their Black colleagues, and I have chosen to feature a white female teacher as she has the most work to do in committing to this transition. So this is just one example of how restorative justice could look in school and how teachers and students can work together to integrate the spirit of restorative justice in their school days. Next slide, please. So now that we can understand the structure of the project, that we can review the few key elements of the literature review, primarily that deterrence policy which is the foundation of zero tolerance, is not effective in schools as students are not rational actors. And the goal of restorative justice in schools is to change the experience of children and teachers to develop the crucial relationships every day for the effective implementation of the restorative justice values. Next slide, please. So for the creative hypothetical aspect of my project, I broke down the days of a teacher and 3 of her students. And throughout the day, the teacher and students use skills like conflict mediation and engage with resources at their school, like the restorative justice coordinator and mental health staff to learn and heal in the spirit of restorative justice. I'm including a link to the full schedule and my app prototype in the chat to kind of get an idea of how this looks. The app includes a self-monitored behavior tracker, a crisis management portal, and mediation functions for students, as well as additional help for teachers. Essentially, these act as examples for the recommendations made in the literature review, as the discretion of teachers plays into how these recommendations are actually implemented. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I first became compelled to research the racial discipline gap when reading Dr. Morris's book Push Out during the COVID-19 pandemic. The 2 reasons for her book that were so shocking were that the current discipline models are obviously not working, and that every classroom is so variable that the implementation needs real work in understanding how it can work in the classrooms. So I hope that this is a tool that can demonstrate the benefit and accessibility of this practice to teachers, principals, and districts around the country. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Finley. Evan is next, and he is an undergraduate fellow.
Hi, my name is Evan Pan, and I'm a 2nd-year Canfield Business Honors and Government double major. And my faculty mentor was Dr. Patrick Bixler. And if you're listening to this, Dr. Pixler, thank you for your help, your expertise, and enthusiasm. It really was appreciated and it helped me persevere through the project. Next slide, please. So a little bit about myself and how I got to this topic. I grew up in a non-urban part of East Texas where there weren't many people who looked like me. And I specifically remember trying to reconcile countless incidents, such as like a school administration defending yellowface or teachers assuming that I didn't know English. And so although I came to UT for more opportunity professionally and academically, I think it's the lack of cultural and ideological fit that'll keep me from returning to a community like that in East Texas in the future. And so herein kind of lies this brain drain problem, because aspiring talented youth, like some of my best friends from home, are leaving rural Americas in search for opportunities in urban areas. And it seems like this trend disproportionately affects minorities. And so my research kind of attempts to identify to what extent this migration is caused by ideological misalignment. Next slide, please. And so to kind of map out the landscape, the research landscape, Chomarty and Buchholz write in 2008 that there are various definitions of rurality. The USDA uses an administrative definition based on municipality and city government. The Census Bureau uses like an urban definition based on population density, while some economic research attempts a more holistic definition of rurality. Basically, the consensus is that it's extremely difficult to pinpoint what is rural, and oftentimes what is rural is simply what is not urban. And then Parker kind of writes in 2020 that rural America is growing at 1/4 the rate of suburban and urban America. They're getting bachelor's degrees at slower rates. And over the last decade, 50% of all rural counties have shrunken in population. So what we're seeing is that rural America is undergoing some of the largest economic challenges of their times. And Joel Heckner writes in 1995 that a lot of times aspiring young individuals are leaving rural America in pursuit of opportunity with little intent to return. Those that do return or even stay often stay for the network effects of family and community. And then Waldorf kind of qualifies this in 2007 that urban areas are more likely to kind of receive these college educated migrants than rural areas are. Next slide, please. Moving into our methods and data analysis, we firstly identified 3 data sets from the American Ideology Project, the Applied Population Laboratory, and the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. And our data analysis largely consisted of using Pearson correlation tests and a bivariate regression model to assess the relationship between mean ideology score, Republican vote share, and non-white migration of 20 to 30-year-olds in non-metro counties. And through our analysis, we kind of observed a statistically significant positive correlation between mean ideology score and the proportion of non-white migration. And our model indicates that for every 0.1 increase in mean ideology score, we observe a 0.133 increase in the proportion of non-white migration of total migration. Next slide, please. So kind of looking at our limitations, one of the largest ones was that our data set only recognized counties based on a metro non-metro basis, where counties with a population over 50,000 were metro and those under were non-metro. This kind of weakens our analysis because it blurs the lines of like suburbs that might exist as well. Secondly, our data is from 2000 to 2010, which excludes key political shifts that were displayed in the 2016 and 2020 elections. And some conclusions that I came with out of this project. Firstly, I think that there's a critical lack of research, investment, and even consensus on rural and urban areas and what is rural. And secondly, I think that if we further explore this relationship between conservative ideology and rural brain drain, we could further direct these future civic engagement and economic revitalization strategies that are really key to bringing these and upholding this part of rural America. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan, for researching something that you're so passionate about that speaks directly to you. Next, we have Blair.
Hello, my name is Blair Berry, and my wonderful CSRD faculty mentor was Dr. Raji Srinivasan, and my topic is the Black hair care landscape. Who owns Black hair care products? Next. So to start, I want to say what I mean by the Black hair care landscape. When I say that, I mean all of the entities involved, either in the production or consumption of Black hair care products. And so with this research, I wanted to examine this landscape, and particularly through the lens of ownership. So I wanted to see what demographic groups have the largest ownership share of the production and distribution of Black hair care products. So to do this, I started by looking at producers, so the large companies and small companies involved in this landscape. And what I found is that the top 3 hair care products in the United States, so you have Cantu, Shea Moisture, and Carol's Daughter, are all owned by white-owned companies. And even on the local landscape, of the 9,000 or so beauty supply stores in the United States, 2/3 of those are Korean owned. So what we're seeing here is that within the Black hair care landscape, most Black hair care products are not owned by Black entities. And moving from producers to consumers, one of the biggest insights about the consumer landscape is that the Black dollar is powerful. So what this means is that Black buying power, which is estimated to be around $1.4 trillion right now, is increasing rapidly, and it's only expected to increase over the next few years. And with this increase in power comes more influence, especially given the context of the Black Lives Matter movement. Black consumers are increasingly pushing for more Black-owned products in all industries, but especially within the hair care industry. And one of the last insights that I came across was that Black consumers are also ditching chemical straighteners and hair relaxers to return back to their natural hair. Next slide. As far as the methods involved in this research, my secondary research, which is what I started with, involved a combination of analyzing reports and articles, mainly from the marketing research firms Mintel and Nielsen. And then with primary research, with the help of Dr. Srinivasan and Barbara, I created a survey and administered it to Black students at UT. And one of the biggest findings from this is that 100% of respondents were all natural, all wore their natural hair, and most had gone natural within the last 7 to 10 years. So this corroborates the national trend of a Black reversion to natural hair. Next slide. So the main discussion questions that arise from this research is, why is it that Black hair care products are usually not owned by Black entities? And what is it that's keeping this discrepancy alive? In answer to the first question, that's a host of centuries of systemic racism and systemic processes. In answer to the second question, the biggest thing that I found was dependency. If you are a Black-owned company and you want to break into the Black hair care industry, you are dependent on non-Black forces. And so you're dependent on those because that's who have the power and also who control the resources. As far as limitations, as you can see with the clock to the side, time was probably the biggest limitation because I changed my topic sort of toward the end and had to get approval again. So this sort of limited the scope of what I was able to accomplish with this research. Also, my survey size was a small sample, and I used snowball sampling, which is it's non-random. So my survey is not representative of the Black UT population, and definitely not of Black Americans within the United States. Next slide. So as far as my conclusion and recommendations, so I conclude that Black representation in all industries is increasing, but especially in the Black hair care landscape. And I expect that it's only going to stay this way and get more representative over time. So my recommendation to companies, especially to non-Black producers of Black hair care products, would be to embrace and nurture these changes and to help create a more representative and equitable Black hair care landscape. And this concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Blair. I'll definitely be thinking about your research as I deep condition my natural hair tonight. Next up, we have a grad fellow, Marcelo. Marcelo, are you there?
Oh, sorry. So I'm, yes, you are listening me? Are you listening me? Hello? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, sorry, guys. Sorry.
No, you're
Sorry,
good.
sorry again. Um, my name is Marcelo Domingos from the History Department. So my CSRD research was it's called Archives, Exiles, and Counter Revolution, an investigation of the intelligence files on the BPP International section and Brazilian dissidents at 1970 Algiers. So next, please. Uh, Basically, my research is based on one event that happened in Algiers, in 1970. So in 1970, Algiers, or the city of Algiers, was a kind of a safe haven for the leftists all over the world. So at the same time, we have different groups from leftist groups, including the Black Panthers Party, the international section, and also the Brazilian leftists at the same moment. So in my current investigation on the Brazilian intelligence report, I found many references to the Black Panthers Party influence on the Brazilian politics. It's a part of the Brazilian dictatorship rhetorics that states that any kind of racism discussions came from abroad, including the Black Panthers Party. So because of this, I start to think of myself, what happened in Algiers? Because we're supposed to have this clash of different ideas of left occurred in 1970 and 1970. And 10 years after that, the same Brazilian leftists is starting new leftist parties, and they don't discuss race. So because I found very interesting the fact that the Brazilian leftists until today, they don't like to discuss race, despite the fact that they had context of different perspectives of race and class. The next, please. The relevance in my study lies, I want to prove that the Brazilian intelligence report, the mentions that I found on the Black Panthers parties was just a part of a rhetoric, a state rhetoric that used to the state rhetoric from Brazilian state rhetoric that used to blame only the external forces to discuss to explain how the Brazilians were supposed to discuss race. So next, please. So my answer, I used to consult the CIA files, especially looking for the reference to the Black Panthers Party Eldridge Cleaver at Algiers, and also the Brazilian intelligence report abroad in a service called CX. So I also use the words Black Panthers, Eldridge Cleaver, Algiers, and leftist groups. And also I use many secondary sources at that time. So what I found, next, please. So unfortunately, using the declassified files was very interesting at the same time as far as it was a little frustrating, because the CIA files in 1970s, the declassified files on the 1970s only covered we want to bring some elements from the American media at that time. And in 1975, the CIA was investigated by a commission called Rockefeller Commission. So, and the declassified files on Black Panthers and Eldridge Cleaver and all these guys basically were just files talk about the CIA, not talk about what the CIA did in Algiers. So in Brazilian files on its turn, I found no evidence, no clear evidence of the BPP influence, just suspicions. So I finished my work, my research with more questions, but at the same time answered my main question. Next, please. So, intermission. So what happened to, yes, more questions. In my case, what I found, what exactly happens? What the CIA still covers, because this document is still secret. They are not declassified. So I also find very interesting the possibility to interview the BPP, the Black Panthers militants and Brazilian militants, so well, to finish my my research. So I think I can, I think it's all for now, guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcelo. Up next, we have Janet, and she's an undergraduate fellow.
Hi, I can't seem to start my video. It says it's still disabled. Thank you. Hello, so my name is Janet Aboulies, and I did my project on institutional ambiguity and human rights abuses, migrant domestic worker law in Lebanon and Turkey. And my faculty mentor is Dr. Jeremy Suri, as he guided me throughout this project. Next slide, please. So what I chose to study was the abusive kafala sponsorship system in Lebanon, which governs the legal status of migrant domestic workers in the country and how it bears similarities both in the legal apparatus and on the ground experience to the Turkish ILO Convention number 189, which provides basic regulations for migrant domestic workers. So in both countries, migrant domestic workers are excluded from the state's labor protection laws, including labor law number 4857 in Turkey and the Lebanese Labor Code of 1946. So this essay argues that the similarities in the shared experience of domestic workers in Lebanon and Turkey necessitates the understanding of labor law protections as a transnational issue and not only on a state-by-state basis. Furthermore, the government tactic of intentional ambiguity in the laws regulating the status of migrant domestic workers may benefit the state by absolving it of the responsibility for the group of workers. Next slide, please. So on institutional ambiguity, Jessie Nassar and Nora Stell in their article, Lebanon's Response to the Syrian Refugee Crisis, Institutional Ambiguity as a Governance Strategy, argue that there's a strategic component to the institutional ambiguity that now regulates the status of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. They also argue that there is a political utility in maintaining uncertainty. So to deal with the challenge of studying such a concept that may not have empirical values to analyze, they turn to the notion of agnotology, which is an innovative and interdisciplinary approach to the politics of knowledge. Moreover, this includes the study of agnogenesis, which is the process of generating or maintaining ignorance. So this concept of agnogenesis can be applied to the Lebanese governance strategy and the status of migrant domestic workers. So within the ILO's convention concerning decent work for domestic workers, number 189, this is the Turkish domestic worker regulation law, Article 1. So the term domestic work is referred to as work that's performed in or for a household or households, while domestic worker means any person engaged in domestic work within an employment relationship. A person who performs domestic work only occasionally or sporadically and not on an occupational basis is not a domestic worker. So this definition is quite broad and coincidentally drawn up for the purpose of delineating those who should be to the rights and protections contained in the ILO Convention number 189. So furthermore, Turkish legislation lacks a definition for domestic workers, as the details are left to the interpretation of lawyers and practice of the High Court appeals. This means that many cases involving domestic workers' rights are left to the mercy of interpretation of law. Next slide, please. So Human Rights Watch states that an estimated 250,000 migrant domestic workers work in Lebanon, and the majority of women are African and Southeast Asian, from Southeast Asian countries, so such as Ethiopia, the Philippines, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. The kafala system is a restrictive immigration regime of laws, regulations, and customary practices that ties migrant workers' legal residency to their employer. It regulates migrant domestic workers' legal status in the country, and Lebanon's labor protection laws do not apply to them. So many organizations have documented the abusive conditions that migrant domestic workers in Lebanon have been subjected to and are to the control that the kafala system grants employers over their workers' lives. So Amnesty International, in one of their reports, described the exploitative working conditions that migrant domestic workers experience to be including long working hours, no breaks, verbal, physical, and sexual abuse, restrictions on access to healthcare, and human trafficking. Next slide, please. I just wanted to address some limitations before I give my acknowledgements. So some limitations of the study are the lack of access to archives in Lebanon and Turkey containing physical copies of governance documents, and also the inability to interview migrant domestic workers directly and relying on interview material from other independent organizations. Another limitation is the small sample size of documented migrant domestic worker experiences. So in this future, the study may be furthered by focusing on the experiences of migrant domestic labor through a specific lens, such as through the experience of the workers through their gendered lens, as most of them are women, the impact on of the political economy on institutional ambiguity, the correlation between human rights violations and ambiguous citizenship laws, etc. And so I want to acknowledge and thank my mentor, Dr. Jeremy Suri, for guiding me and supporting me throughout this research and writing process. And I also want to thank Dr. Emily Wellen and David Judson for their invaluable guidance. And also, of course, all my mentors here at the CSRD Fellowship. Your guidance has been invaluable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. Up next, we have Christina.
Hi, my name is Christina Leopuentes, and I am the master's student at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and a former public school teacher. My CSRD report is on the curriculum for democracy, examining the effect of civic education on civic engagement in the United States. I want to say thank you to Dr. Reyes for mentoring me on the direction of my research, and thank you all so much for being with me tonight. Next. Since the turn of the 20th century, the percentage of eligible voters who cast a ballot in the US has seldom exceeded 60%, even for the states with the highest turnout. So politicians are voted in by a minority of the electorate, which has major implications in representation and the health of our democracy. We're going to focus on a key aspect of a healthy democracy, which is civic participation. We know that education is one of the strongest predictors, but the research connecting civics to engagement is less clear. Next. After beginning my research, I began to wonder how much civic education could close this participation gap that we see on both big and small scales across the country. And this led me to the research question, how is state-level civic engagement affected by state-mandated civic curriculum? I chose to examine high school graduation requirements for civics because I could compile the latest state statutes and because the majority of school-age children attend public schools. I couldn't find any existing research that attempted to compare the quality of state-level civics with various state civic engagement rankings. So given the heterogeneity of these rankings and the language of state standards, statistical pooling was not possible. Next. Once intended to assimilate recent immigrants, today's conception of civics has transformed into this curriculum that teaches students about their agency, and it's rooted in critical race theory, which wouldn't have happened without the civic activism of Afrocentrists of the 1960s calling to end cultural imperialism in civics. And you may have seen that CRT is at risk in Texas right now. Though 31 states require either one semester of US government or civics, 10 states have no formal civics requirements at all, and only 9 states require a full year of US government or civics. The average state rankings on volunteerism show that the US has not exceeded about a 29% rate in almost 20 years. Not surprisingly, income level is another strong predictor of engagement, with less than half of registered voters making under $10,000 having voted in the 2016 election. Overall, most states' volunteer rankings, voter turnout rankings, and political engagement rankings were not consistent with each other and did not correlate with state standards for civics. Additionally, the inconsistent definitions of civics across state requirements, combined with this wide variance in teaching practices, makes it challenging to discern the rigor and the expectations for each state's students, as well as to measure the overall effect of civic education on civic engagement. Next. Civics must educate students on how to stay informed on current events, how to engage elected officials, and how to participate in elections. And civics courses must help students develop early habits of community volunteerism and activism, such as through service learning opportunities. Finally, civic education today aspires to explore the intersection of race with issues of justice and the law to promote active citizenship. Teaching civics would become culturally and linguistically responsive. Learning would become centered around the students' lived experiences and reflect their diversity, identities, and histories. However, as there is limited research to support longitudinal outcomes of civics, we must invest in civic education research that measures its impact on the health of American democracy and political and civic engagement. So the curriculum for democracy starts with innovative, multidisciplinary, and research-backed civic education practices that will shape community attitudes and culture. But that is only the beginning. As evidence shows, people who struggle to meet basic needs are unable to civically engage, and policymakers must invest in low-income communities, expand voting rights, challenge institutional racism across all policies, and so much more. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina, and thanks for forfeiting your class of 2021 toast at the LBJ fountain to do this presentation for us today. We have Megan next, and she is an undergraduate researcher.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Nguyen, and I am a senior studying sociology, journalism, and Black studies. My research paper is titled Eyes Upon You, Policing, Carcerality, and Activism at the University of Texas at Austin and Beyond. And my faculty mentor is the amazing Dr. Simone Brown. Next slide, please. So on June 16th, 2020, 22 days after the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, hundreds of members of the UT Austin community circulated a petition titled Defund the Police at the University of Texas at Austin. The pitch was simple. In the wake of global uprisings against ongoing police murders of Black and Brown people, universities are beginning to reckon with the role of police on their campuses, and students, faculty, and staff alike are calling for UT Austin to critically examine the role of policing and surveillance on its campus. So in this paper, I draw from a wide variety of scholarship, and I write from an abolitionist perspective, taking into consideration Dr. Damien Sojourner's argument that schools have historically reproduced logics and mechanisms of carcerality that perpetually subject Black and Brown bodies to state surveillance and violence. Knowing this, I pose this question. How do we organize and study for a decolonial abolitionist world in which there would be no prisons or police and maybe no universities either? Next slide, please. So my research paper is divided into 3 sections, the first of which details the history, expansion, and legitimization of campus police, with special attention to the UT Austin Police Department. In this section, I give context and offer a historical analysis of the formation of campus police departments in the US, including how student unrest due to anti-war protests and the UT Tower shooting in 1966 legitimized and justified the need for a campus police department. I also briefly go over several instances where the UT PD has functioned to quell and suppress student activism, including the arrest of 10 UT students who were protesting for the creation of an Asian American Studies department on campus in 1999, as you can see in this article. Lastly, I detail the expansion of the UT Austin Police Department into West Campus, a residential area over which they historically have never had official jurisdiction over, after $8 million was allocated to them for this purpose in the spring of 2020 by the Board of Regents. I also discussed the high activity location observation cameras being installed in West Campus and the implications that holds for student privacy and surveillance in the residential neighborhood. Next slide, please. In my next section, I acknowledge the other ways outside of policing that the University of Texas at Austin participates in a logic of carcerality. This includes UT Austin's investments in private prison companies and military funding, partnerships and contracts with companies like Aramark and Texas Correctional Industries to provide food and furniture on campus, and punitive policies around sexual violence, academic probation, and more. In the section, I briefly document these links and I argue that the university's ties to the prison industrial complex undermine but cannot be extricated from its educational mission within racial capitalism. So I end the section with this sentence: policing, discipline, and punishment help to render the regime of education more durable in the hands of the state. Next slide, please. So to this day, students, faculty, and staff at universities across the country are organizing collectively to build a future university beyond punishment, policing, and violence. In this last section, I highlight past and present activism at UT Austin and other campuses in the United States, demonstrating how this activism is enabling people within the ivory tower to really assert their agency against carcerality and towards an abolition democracy. One way that students are organizing right now is through the Cops Off Campus Coalition, which is a national coalition of universities across the nation. UT Austin has its own chapter of Cops Off Campus. Actually, this past Sunday, they dropped a banner off of the Moody College pedestrian bridge, as you can see in this picture. So these students are really taking up the call for police abolition on their campuses in really creative and impactful ways, including holding town halls, dropping banners, hosting teach-ins, distributing zines, and more. I really hope to expand on this research in the future for sure, but it looks like my time is up. So thank you all for listening, and thanks to everyone at CSRD and Dr. Simone Brown for guiding me through this research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. Next up, we have Riley, and she is also an undergraduate fellow.
Hi, I'm Riley, and I looked at food insecurity on college campuses in UT, and I want to thank Dr. DeFrancesco Soto, Dr. Joseph, Barbara, and Emily for all their help and guidance. Next slide. Food insecurity is a prevalent issue throughout the world in the United States. In 2019, 10.5% or 13.7 million households were food insecure, and the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated many of the existing flaws in our food system. While the exact number from the USDA has not been released, a study from Northwestern indicates that in 2020, the rate of food insecurity was 23% of households across the US. Furthermore, it has been shown that food insecurity disproportionately impacts college students. Anywhere from 14 to 59% of college students are food insecure. The only and most recent study of food insecurity at UT was from 2014 to 2015 that showed 23.5 or 1 in 4 UT students were food insecure. Food insecurity on college campuses has been linked to missing classes, study sessions, exams, organization events, as well as dropping classes. All of these factors impact students' college experience, mental health, and academic performance. Next slide. The conceptualization of food insecurity in college campuses is directly linked to the commodification and neoliberalization of higher education throughout the United States. Wesley Schumar describes the commodification of higher education as a model to discuss the process by which the economic overtakes the institutions and aspects of social life. On the next slide, I'm going to overview some of the UT policies impacting food insecurity across campuses and the ways in which that is linked to the commodification of higher education. Dining dollars and Vivo Bucks has changed from a price-based system to unlimited swipes for all-you-can-eat buffets. Previously, the money allotted did not allow for students to have 3 meals a day at the dining halls, and this allows them to have 3 meals a day, which increases their accessibility to food. However, with this came, you can't take food out of the dining halls, and you can't swipe in your friends or classmates for meals, as well as decreasing the amount of dining dollars for students to use at campus-specific restaurants and stores. Therefore, students have less money to spend on essential items, including shampoo, conditioner, laundry detergent, among others. So while this did increase food security, it created additional barriers. The price of meals at UT dining halls, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average American spends roughly $4 per meal. UT dining halls serve breakfast for $8 and dinner for $12. This leaves students without a meal plan spending 2 to 3 times more on a meal than average. And further, The $8 to $12 meal prices demonstrates the cost evaluation being used to calculate the price of meal plans for students. The UT Farm Stand is a community garden that is used to sell produce bi-monthly at the UT Farm Stand market. However, it is priced higher than the nearest grocery store. The UT Outpost is the on-campus food pantry that allows one visit per month per student without any restrictions to family income or financial aid status. It allows students to have about 15 to 20 pounds of food. However, the average American eats about 4 to 5 pounds of food per day. So a lot of students have said how increasing the amount of those visits per month would allow students greater access to food. Transportation and access to grocery stores. The nearest grocery store to campus is 1.6 miles away, and there is not direct public transportation from UT or West Campus to the nearest HEB. And so students do have to take 2 buses and do not have access. And then SNAP, a lot of college students do not have access to SNAP under the current laws and regulations. However, there has been policy introduced at the state and federal level to increase college students' accessibility to SNAP. However, with the Texas House about to end session, it doesn't look like that's going to be passed in Texas, but maybe on the federal level coming soon. And so on the next slide, the way that the UHD works is that it's completely separate from the university and is ran as its own business, separate from the university. And so because of that, all of the costs and services fall directly on the student. And so UT should subsidize UHD services as well as provide more funding for the UT outposts to combat and mitigate food insecurity on campus, as well as advocate for bus lines on the local level to the nearest grocery store and SNAP accessibility on the state and federal level. And so that is what I think UT should be doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Riley. Wow, $12 for a plate of dinner is pretty expensive. Thank you for sharing light to that issue that students have on campus. Next up, we have a graduate fellow, Brooke.
Hi everyone. It looks like I'm not available or I'm not able to start my video. It says the host has stopped it. So if the host can turn on my video, that'd be great. Okay. Great. Thank you. So hello, my name is Brooke Shannon. I'm a PhD student in UT's government department, and my report for the CSRD fellowship is a chapter of my dissertation called Progressive State Building at the Local Level. I want to say a special shout out and thank you to Dr. Amy Liu, also in the government department, who was a fabulous faculty mentor this year. Next slide, please. All right, so a theoretical introduction and background to this project. I based this off of a 1982 book by Stephen Skoranek, who talks about the progressive era as a reconstitution of national government, meaning a creation of a strong administrative state. And he calls it a breaking of national government from the grip of local politics. During this era, local reforms reflected the desire of progressive reformers to run the cities in America like businesses as incorporated corporations as opposed to governments. And during this time, race permeated all policymaking in local or in all areas. My research looks at local areas though. During this time, streets and public spaces were named after icons of the Confederacy, and many of the Confederate statues that are now being taken down were actually erected during this time. Next slide, please. So my hypotheses for this project are that local government expanded their administrative states as well, using local civil service, so creating different local agencies and nominating and appointing people to staff them essentially. Hypothesis number 2 says the cities used land use policies to develop and to segregate cities. I look specifically to a policy at the intersections of land use, service provision, and race, which is cemeteries. So the data from this project come from Austin City Council. I look at every item on the agenda of City Council from 1910 through 1929, and I coded every item with a substantive policy topic code that is modified from the Policy Agendas project. So the graph that we see here is meetings per year and items per year on the City Council agenda. We can see that the low point is 1919. During that time, the City Council only met a few times to talk about whether or not a mask ordinance could be lifted and whether people could open up their businesses during the Spanish flu pandemic of the time. But in 1920, the government starts bouncing back, at least in terms of items they discuss on the City Council agenda. The meetings do not recover in just the number of meetings per year. And what that indicates is that the City Council has begun to create this administrative state where they're delegating power and empowering bureaucracy. So I look to nominations and appointments. Leaves of absence begin to drop in 1924 as the City Council reforms itself into an at-large system from a commission, but the bulk of nominations are in police and fire and streets and sanitary departments, which really show what the council was prioritizing. Next slide, please. On the left, we see types of policies that cemeteries are mentioned in, the bulk of which are in government operations and parks and cemeteries. This represents bids for supplies. This is like carts and coffins for poor people, which were separated by race. Parks and cemeteries, of course, that's where cemeteries are really mentioned. At the beginning, it's within group segregation, where cemeteries are segregated within a single cemetery gates. But by 1919, 1920, they start to make between group segregation when Plumbers is opened as a municipal cemetery, as well as Evergreen for African Americans. On the right, we see that race really spans the agenda. All types of policy areas are incorporated with racial politics. This is a dummy variable where any group mentioned, any minority group mentioned is coded as a 1, where all other policies are 0. So this is a really small part of the agenda, total 149 times, but we can see that race is discussed most often in law and crime, government operations, health, and some civil rights as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so some conclusions about race. I also looked at the 1928 city plan that was written that's now known as like the segregating document, and found that only in 2 places they actually discuss race. And what that indicates, when they lament the unconstitutionality of segregating, but then they think, oh, we can do this by service provision, let's just put everybody in this one area. That shows that service provision, it shows that race was so built into the fabric of policymaking that they didn't even have to talk about it that much. So I find that cities reconstituted in similar ways to the national government by creating and staffing a strong administrative state, that the maintenance of their strict racial order based in white supremacy really motivated urbanization of America through land use policies, specifically through cemeteries. And the master plans, they shaped and solidified this type of segregation because the attention to race and race politics was consistent, but an incredibly small proportion of the agenda. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Brooke. Next up, we have McKenna. She's an undergraduate fellow.
All right, great. My name is McKenna, and that was a great presentation to transition to mine because my project, Austin Segregated, the History of Systemic Racism in Austin and its Modern Implications, really focuses around the 1928 city plan. And I just wanted to give a quick thank you to Dr. Elizabeth Mueller, my mentor. And then next slide. Okay, great. So as mentioned, some people are familiar with the 1928 city plan by the consulting firm Koch and Fowler, which first advocated that certain resources and services for Black Austinites be restricted to just a 6 square mile block in East Austin. And there's already a lot of really good work out there that document segregation in Austin and some of its effects, but these often do not look into like actual population data and usually explore the period after the 1928 city plan was implemented. So my paper begins with Austin's founding in 1839 when it was known as Waterloo, and it moves into the 21st century to get a more thorough understanding of what exactly happened in Austin's freedmen communities and what the city's dynamics were like before the consolidation of the Black population into East Austin. And in fact, there's actually 15 freedmen communities in Austin prior to the beginning of the 20th century, and some of the schools and churches and stores that they built still stand today. And actually in the process of researching this, I discovered that there's an old grocery store just a few blocks away from my apartment in West Campus, which was once known as the Wheatville community. So as I said before, there's already a lot of good work out there that examines different aspects and effects of Austin's de jure segregation. So I wanted to incorporate these works into a more holistic body. So this literature review was pretty massive, and I touched on a lot of different topics, such as the process of school desegregation, the effects of the New Deal, the effects of redlining and racial deed restrictions, and the politics of the 60s era fair housing ordinance based on the federal Fair Housing Act, among many other topics. So I also added some more scientific studies, such as those examining tuberculosis rates in different parts of the city, or the number of healthy food options in different parts of the city as well. And in addition to historical and current newspaper articles that touch on segregation. And big surprise, tuberculosis rates were higher in East Austin, while healthy food options were sparser in East Austin, which someone else has also touched on in their research. So I also wanted to include some of the data available on more modern day levels of inequality to offer tangible evidence of how pervasive systemic inequalities are today. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, we totally said, I went past this. Next slide again. Okay, so in addition to my literature review and income data analysis, I analyzed census tract data from the years 1940, 1950, 1960, 1970, 1990, and 2010 to measure the flux of population in various parts of the city. And I specifically focus on tracts covering Old West Austin, East Austin, and the former Wheatville and Clarksville communities, just because those were two of the biggest of the freedmen communities. So unfortunately, I could not find census tract level data for 1930, which obviously was the census that occurred most recently after the implementation of the infamous city plan, but I was still able to trace a gradual movement into East Austin by Black and Latino residents. And so, of course, other limitations do include the unavailability of the 2020 census and the fact that census tracts do not map out exactly onto neighborhoods. So next slide, please. Okay, and after looking through the census data, I think it is very clear that Black residents did in fact get pushed into East Austin due to a number of different policies, but the neighborhood of Clarksville actually did remain an outlier for many years during the 20th century. And there were clear ramifications for this segregation, such as income inequality, a lack of environmental justice, unequal schooling, a decline in affordable housing due to rampant gentrification in various parts of Austin, but especially in East Austin. And this gentrification is caused by decades of undervaluation of this land, which made it more affordable compared to other areas that are near the downtown part of Austin, in addition to recent redevelopment efforts that are now refocusing on this area and some zoning changes that are allowing for this gentrification. And then while the city has begun to acknowledge and reckon with its past, it still has a long way to go to mitigate these effects. And the city also shows no signs of preventing further gentrification, or relatively few to be generous. And I think it's important for all Austinites to recognize the ways in which systemic inequality has affected and continues to affect our city, so we can all be more conscious citizens and neighbors. And that concludes my presentation. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you, McKenna. We have our very last presentation by Sean. He will be talking about political agenda setting. He is an undergraduate fellow.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shyam Madhani, and I'll be presenting my research today entitled Political Agenda Setting and Racial Integration in Public Schools. It'll be a case study comparing Denver Public Schools and New York District 15. And a big thank you to my faculty mentor, who is Professor Renita Coleman. Next slide. A little bit of introduction and statistics on the current statistics surrounding racial segregation in our public schools. Currently, greater than 50% of students live in racially concentrated school districts, where greater than 75% of students are either white or non-white. And this racial segregation leads to disparities in funding, where majority white school districts receive greater than $23 billion more in funding than majority POC districts. And so integration, although it's constitutionally required, has never been implemented fully, and integration can definitely be one means of addressing disparities in funding and equalizing outcomes. I use two theories of political agenda setting in order to provide the theoretical framework to analyze my interview data. And these two theories are multiple streams analysis and punctuated equilibrium theory. These two theories really attempt to answer the question of how and why politicians divide their limited attention among the many issues facing their communities. Next slide. The main puzzle that my research attempted to ask is, in the past several years, certain school districts, a vast minority of the school districts that are segregated, have voluntarily implemented certain integration plans. And so I wanted to look at what two specific districts that in the past several years have implemented integration plans and how and why those arrived on the local political agenda and how and why those were approved. The rationale for this research was that if more is known about how these integration plans are approved, potentially more school districts could approve these integration plans. And so I conducted 5 interviews with knowledgeable people in Denver Public Schools in New York District 15, and I used the theoretical frames to analyze this interview data. Next slide. So what did I find? In Denver, I conducted 3 interviews. One interview with the leader of the Strengthening Neighborhoods Initiative, which was the task force assigned to develop the integration policy, and 2 other interviews with people who wished to remain anonymous. What I found was that there were key focusing events that drew attention to the issue of segregation within schools. The first was the Bailey Report, which really emphasized racial discrimination and structural racism within Denver public schools. Gentrification, which led to decreasing enrollment and school closures, which really drew media attention to racial disparities in school enrollment and school closures that gentrification caused. Also, there was a very willing school board to use a racial equity as a lens for creating policy at the time. And so that willing school board was essential to this policy being approved. Also identified the co-chairs of the Strengthening Neighborhoods Initiative as policy entrepreneurs. And what that means is they actively framed the issue and helped implement it. And they were essential to that process. And so they framed the issue as racial segregation rather than any other frame such as funding or anything like that. And that really informed the solution, which was racial integration. In New York District 15, I conducted 2 interviews, one with the superintendent of New York District 15 and one with the leader of an interest group, Parents for Middle School Equity. What I really found was that there are very similar events that happened in New York District 15 than in Denver. And so there was a report released about New York District 15 that drew media attention. There was lots of rise in gentrification in New York District 15, which changed enrollment. And there was also recently during that time, President Trump had recently been elected, which caused liberal backlash in the district, which also set the stage for this policy. And there was also a willing and local central district DOE there. And there were also policy entrepreneurs, which were the Parent for Middle School Equity Group. And they also actively used the media to frame their issue, or to frame the issue facing the school district as one of segregation. And next slide. And so in conclusion, I found that these key factors in the school districts of gentrification, people actively framing the issue as racial segregation and using the media to highlight disparities in the education system as one caused by segregation, as well as access to data and pressured and willing leadership as key factors that led to interest convergence at a specific time in these school districts, which were really essential to getting the integration plans passed in Denver Public Schools and New York District 15. Thank you very much.
All right.
Go ahead, Dr. Joseph.
Yeah, we're gonna, with the time that we have left, if Barbara, you can take your screen share off. We can see each other again. I'll start with some questions that we already had in the chat, but really, if anybody who's presented wants to, because there's so many different great presentations. What I'll do is throw this at really everyone. Considering what we've seen in terms of the first 4 months of the Biden administration, people just raise your hand if you want to answer this. So this is to everybody, whether you're doing food justice or reproductive rights or desegregation or comparative Lebanon and Turkey and women and work. What ways do you think this research helps in terms of impact, in terms of producing a more just, more equitable world? You know, what ways? Does anybody want to tackle that for me? Anybody want to put their hand up? Christina.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of an
Dana.
answer. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay, sorry. I was thinking of an answer to a question that you had asked me in the chat, and it kind of answers this as well. I was thinking, so under the Biden administration, the Department of Education actually proposed a couple of priorities for the American history and civics education programs to improve the quality of American history and civics and government, as well as information literacy skills, and also how to train teachers on these subjects in elementary and secondary schools, which I think is important because it needs to start early. But as my research showed, there is not research on the effects, the long-term outcomes of civics. And here we are working on proposals for civics at the federal level without the research backing. So I think that my research calls for that, and it should happen on a national scale to have better practices in civic curriculum.
Great. Thank you, Christine. Thank you. Dana.
This is a great question. So the Biden administration's done one thing that I like and two things that I need them to do. And the first thing that they've done recently is they appointed a new chair to the Food and Drug Administration, and they've called for a review of the REMS, which is the classification they have on mifepristone, which is one of the medication abortion drugs. And if they removed this classification of the medication abortion drug, which a lot of people, including the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists, say is an over-regulation basically of the medication, it would be able to be prescribed through telemedicine. So it would be something that you don't necessarily have to go to an abortion clinic right now in person, be there, deal with all of these regulations we know we have in Texas and other states. You could have an online consultation with a nurse practitioner or a nurse or another healthcare person, and they could prescribe it. So this is huge for access, right? And this is definitely a step in the right direction. We don't see the FDA as a political entity, but of course, when it comes to abortion and reproductive health, you see things that aren't typically politicized. But the two things that I need them to do is at first I need them to repeal the Hyde Amendment, which was a campaign promise that has since not been followed up on, which makes that insurance coverage can't be covered for abortion care. And the second thing is to really come out in response to the Supreme Court's decision to take up the Mississippi 15-week abortion ban.
Great. Thank you, Dana. Janet.
Yeah, to answer to your question, I think it's important, I guess this research and our research in particular, looking at social issues and how it's going to help contribute. I think just even pushing the narrative in a certain way and having research out and language out, we're learning how important media is in setting the tone for a lot of social justice issues. Like currently we're hearing about what's happening in Colombia, the military crackdowns, we're hearing about the military crackdowns in Palestine. And so understanding that, looking at how media is portraying certain issues and what kind of research we have accessible to us to verbalize what we are seeing and the connections between different issues that we think may not be interrelated, but are and are issues of international solidarity and really like fights against imperialism, that helps us situate ourselves as global citizens. And to the question in the chat, it helps us understand that our struggles and our work and our social work is interrelated to other people's liberation as well.
Thank you, Janet. Anybody else, or I'll just start picking people. There's so many people who've done stuff on racial segregation, Brooke and McKenna. I would start with you, Brooke, and then McKenna. Just very quickly, because I want to get to as many people as possible. What's one policy thing that what's one policy issue that could bend the curve on racial integration that the Biden administration could do? I'm thinking now federal. I'm thinking federal.
Sure. I mean, I think there's so much. There's so much like within HUD itself at the national level to affect policy. Obviously at the federal, we have a federal system. So at the national level, there are lots of reports that can be issued. At the time of my research, right, like there was this also racist idea that Black folks were not urban. And now it's flipped, right, that Black folks are rural. And the reports that come out of HUD often sort of categorize things like affordable housing, public housing as this like blanket issue that affects one type of people of color. And I think the intersections of housing, economics, and education especially are really critical. So I think that HUD could work with cities who have made these policies over hundreds of years at this point to really redefine affordability, redefine density, and the need for like an urban rural connection at the state and national level for this redefinition.
Great, thank you, Brooke. McKenna.
Yeah, I would mention one specific thing that HUD does in particular, which is their housing choice vouchers. And I think that on the city level, that they could use that federal program and to empower residents, because one of the biggest things I uncovered during my research is that currently we're actually seeing a large outmigration of our cities, like Black population, because they're being priced out and because their schools are not as good a quality. So I think that one thing is that the city could use that program to encourage a wider array of landlords and encourage these voucher holders to seek out different neighborhoods and just to learn more about like how this program works.
And then thank you for the folks who are doing classroom stuff, Finley, and there's some other folks. I want to get into the fact that we've seen the 1619 project eviscerated. Nicole Hannah-Jones, was denied tenure at UNC and is getting a 5-year contract instead. And this idea of critical race theory, which it seems like no conservatives know what it means, but they know they hate it. When you ask them what is it, they don't give you an answer about intersectionality and sort of Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and Ian Hanley Lopez and people who created this field of studies and legal studies to push back against the idea that the law was objective, because the law is not, right? What can be done? How can we get both a restorative justice classroom, but even the whole, a classroom that doesn't do violence through the curriculum, based on this? I'll start with Finley. And be very brief, please.
Yeah. I mean, I think I put something in the chat just about how the prioritization by teachers to teach in this way and to encourage a peaceful classroom, and instead of focusing on standard benchmark tests has been shown to allow teachers that kind of flexibility. But then by allowing teachers flexibility to try to kind of focus on what matters and what's good in classrooms versus harmful curriculums or harmful discipline practices, then requires really well-trained teachers and teachers who have internalized that kind of restorative justice training. And so one thing that a few different universities around the country have been doing is really incorporating that from like an undergraduate education all the way through any sort of master's or administrative, instead of just including it as kind of like a section of education, educator education. Yeah, so including it in teachers' education from the beginning seems to be part of that.
Thank you. Alex, and then Cheyenne, and then Evan too. You'll be the last in that streak. So what can we do? Because you're dealing with education. What can we do? Just one thing, and then we're gonna go.
Right. I will say the most tangible thing that we can do, and something that's currently happening, is there's a bill that is making ethnic studies a part of graduation requirements. It's already passed through the House, so it's existing. It just has to pass through the Senate. And what that will do is kind of solidify that we're offering students another way to meet graduation requirements. And if you remove it, then you're limiting students. It doesn't cost anything extra. It's just expanding the scope of student classes and what they can do to graduate. And I think if you solidify that in requirements and curriculum, then it makes it harder to go away.
Thank you. Shyam, and then Evan.
Yeah, of course. And so I guess I'll really highlight access to data and data transparency in schools, and how, especially in school districts that have school choice, how applications are received. And in my research, pretty much all the people I interviewed highlighted how data was able to be used by interest groups once it was available to pass or to help get racial integration plans passed. And so I would say if greater transparency on school districts was required for data on how perhaps how segregated classrooms are even within the school or within different schools, I think that could be a great policy to help address the issue.
Great, thank you. Evan.
I think that something that especially the non-metro communities can do to kind of address this issue, and those oftentimes are the most ideologically conservative that might be opposed to critical race theory, is to sponsor the activities that like might not be teaching critical race theory, but definitely encourage thought on like race critically. So activities like speech and debate, like mock trial, like model UN, things that require perspectives from different angles should definitely be sponsored, and usually looks great for anybody. And so I think maybe like city governments can go and help fund that, or even like sponsor a scholarship for students participating in those activities. I think that's a great way for even the most traditional of communities to buy into some level of critical race theory.
One of the last questions, Madeline, in terms of food justice, what can be done when you have a governor who just sort of has ended unemployment starting June 26, which is a food justice issue, and we're in such a rough state for human rights and the rights of trans people and gay people and queer people and Black people and Asian people, an extraordinarily rough state. So what can we do very quickly in terms of food justice?
Yeah, absolutely. So someone I was in contact with, he works at the Office of Sustainability and works as well with the procurement office at Austin. And a big part of what their initiatives in the future are is to create a more pluralistic perspective and incorporate all the food actors along the value chain, from the producers, from the suppliers, to the people who are food retailers, especially those who are POCs, as well, to encourage those businesses. So within procurement contracts, they're incorporating new employment laws in terms of like hours and conditions required for the workers as well. And these are the areas, putting it into these contracts is one way that small municipalities can try to encourage this sort of equitable food access, as well as equitable conditions for the people who are working in these different fields of the food system.
Okay, great. Thank you. That'll be our last word. I mean, we didn't have enough time. I want to thank all of you for this great work. We're at a critical moment in American history. I want to thank Emily Dunkley and Barbara Kufiadin, who are, among the heroes of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, for interacting in a granular way with you all. We're going to hold something in the fall where we'll be able to see each other in person, even if you're not in a new round of fellows, so we can meet. I do want to close by saying all the work that you're doing is more important now than ever. We see it with the Biden administration and the fact that elections matter, but it's important for us to all realize that our democracy is imperiled still. We see it with the Texas governor, not just unemployment, but the new reproduction rights restrictions on women. And really just the very fact that the US Senate, half the Senate, does not want to do an investigation into the white supremacist attack on the nation's capital. So we're in trouble. We're still in trouble. And I remember telling people this throughout the George Floyd crisis and the pandemic, we're in trouble with the voter suppression. And as a historian, I'll tell you, this happened in the late 19th century as well. And it featured racist pogroms against Black people, others as well, but primarily against Black people. And they used violence and legislation. So you saw the violence at the US Capitol, and the legislation is happening apace, right? So just because something becomes the law or a policy does not mean it's morally just, right? Racial slavery was a policy. Women couldn't vote. That was a policy, right? People were attacked for being queer, still are being attacked for being queer. So we have a lot of work to do. Don't give up the fight, but it's important for us to understand the stakes. You know, we have tens of millions of people in the country who voted for a white supremacist, but who on top of that don't want to be able to lose fair and square in democratic elections. So they are anti-democratic. They are anti what this country stands for. So it's important for us to know that when we're thinking about the research we're doing, that this has real world consequences. The positives, as we've seen, are racial equity in the Biden administration. It's an imperfect administration. It's always going to be imperfect. Democracy is imperfect, but it's positive that in a lot of ways, Biden's first 4 months really draws upon the works that everyone here is doing in terms of equity, in terms of saying human beings matter, saying immigrants matter, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders matter, but also immigrants. We have to remember right now there are brothers and sisters of all of us in Palestine who are dying, in Israel as well. So it's not about saying that one section of the Middle East's life matters more than others. It's saying that, yes, Palestinian lives do matter though, you know, and so we have to be able to voice these concerns, and these concerns are connected to everything that we're doing, everything that the center is about. So really thrilled that you could be part of this cohort, this class this year. Even through the pandemic, you know, your work has been heroic. Your presentations were great. And really the presentations on policing and what we had in Brazil, it really shows us what Janet was talking about, this idea of imperialism, this idea of empire. We have to remember Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about imperialism and empire and said that the United States was the greatest purveyor of violence in the whole world. And he said it was going to be a bitter but beautiful struggle to create that beloved community. We needed a revolution of values. So all of this is connected. You know, when we think about civic education, Black women and hair, the Defense Department, and the marginalization of Black women. Finley talked about push out. I teach push out. Monique Morris is one of my heroes intellectually. So everything that everybody did here really is of a piece and is connected. And that's the idea of when we think about intersectional justice, mental health that Kiana did. So this is really bold and brilliant work. You're forever tethered to the center, whether you love it or not. And so I hope to see all of you in the fall. And again, thank you to Emily and to Barbara, and thank you to all you fellows. Okay, thank you. So good night. Have a great rest of your week, and hope to see you all in the fall.